Mhm.
You talked about structured and now moving to unstructured data for analytics. What difference do you see between the structured and unstructured?
A dashboard allows you to answer a range of questions that you've already thought of. It's when you get to the raw data that you now can uncover the unanswered questions. And technically, unstructured data is also a graph model, but I like graph models. Graph models allow you to find unanticipated connections across the data, and that's where data mining and insights becomes really fascinating.
You are been working in the AI side of it from quite a long time before open AI and these technologies were there, models were there. So how do you see the difference between then and now?
So Google was really the first towards really pushing for large scale unstructured data with the Google search engine. And I was fortunate enough to get to work on Bing also when Bing was integrating with Yahoo. So I was able to work across two of the largest non-Google search platforms.
You are been practicing the ethical AI from such a long time. So what is ethical AI and how to apply it?
Well, for me, ethical AI, it's hard to talk about it today without considering AI governance. So a lot of regulations and laws are coming out that are driving specific behaviors around AI. And a lot of them are trying to capture elements of ethics. I've learned the NIST framework and some others.
Welcome to the Executive Outlook. Today's guest is someone who has been shaping how the world think about AI. With over 20 years of experience in cloud, data science and ethical AI, he has helped teams across continents build smarter and fairer systems. Ken, it's amazing to finally have you here. Welcome to the Executive Outlook.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, first, I want to know about your journey, how you started in this field.
All right, so I'm in AI now, but I've not always been working on AI. It goes back to the very beginnings of my technology career. When I graduated, I was obsessed with databases. And so I became a database developer, certified Microsoft DBA, and that's where I really focused. My next role was switching into software testing, and I would generate several megabytes of log files. We're talking back then really big data, megabytes of files. And I would have to analyze. It was a lot of fun. When services start to come along, I quickly moved towards observability with cloud services, and that took me to another level of scale. But what changed everything for me was after I shipped Office 2010, I joined Microsoft Bing. Back then, I was all about structured data. When I saw what you could do with search and with building indexes and classifiers and AI modeling, I knew that that's where I wanted to go because that was the next level for data. And I was no longer at megabytes, gigabytes, terabytes, petabytes. And we were well on our way to exabyte scale when I was at Bing. I've just always been following the data, and it's led me further and further down this adventure. And now we've gone from SQL Server, which was very much about finding precise answers, to now we're all talking about AI and how, you have to deal with inconsistency, risks of hallucination, and all of this uncertainty principle, but it's still data.
Thank you so much for answering that. I have a question that you talked about structured and now moving to unstructured data for analytics. So, what difference do you see between the structured and unstructured?
A dashboard allows you to answer a range of questions that you've already thought of, but maybe you bound them by different date ranges and a couple of filters. It's when you get to the raw data that you now can uncover the unanswered questions. And you add on to that when you get to unstructured data, and technically unstructured data is also a graph model, but I like graph models. Graph models allow you to find unanticipated connections across the data. And that's where data mining and insights becomes really fascinating. And so I love elements of structure, which graphs give you elements of that. And I love plain old blob data and mining text like we would do in Bing and like we're doing with LLMs today, being able to explore and answer questions that you never anticipated. And that's where I really focus a lot of my time is how do you acquire the data? One of my favorite examples, unanticipated joins is the old, but is a group that used to track flight plans for corporate jets, especially ones that were flown by CEOs. And when those would take off and have a flight plan taking them to the Bay Area, there would be a lot of speculation about possible mergers and acquisitions. So who would have thought about joining flight data with potential mergers and acquisitions? But somebody did. And to tell you the truth, in a graph model or if you have these days a large language model, you would be able to find those kinds of hidden relationships. And that's what I love about unstructured data. Whereas when you apply structure, it's really good for creating guardrails, really good for helping you run a business where you know what your KPIs are. But it's limiting when you're trying to find that next opportunity.
That is a very interesting use case which you have shared. So you mentioned about that you are being working in the AI side of it from quite a long time, right? Before open AI and these technologies were there, models were there. So how do you see the difference between then and now?
So Google was really the first towards really pushing for large-scale unstructured data with the Google search engine. And I was fortunate enough to get to work on Bing, also when Bing was integrating with Yahoo. So I was able to work across two of the largest non-Google search platforms. I worked on what we called vertical search. And that really appealed to my old database side because in vertical search, I had image, video, but I also had other verticals like shopping, and I even had celebrities and wine and movies. And with those, we would actually layer in metadata structure to the entities. So we would know that wine should have things like have a score, grapes was it, year was it, those kinds of things. So you would have to add meta knowledge to the entity. And so that's one of the differences. It's much more organic, which allows it to scale much better. The other thing too is we were much more process concerned running search because of the way the business model worked. You had to have people click on ads. So how much processing do you allow? And also people expected an amount of speed. And you had responses in under a second within milliseconds. And so creating things with indexes and indexing things for faster search was something you also don't really do with large language models. And so humans have learned to give AI a little more time because the insights are worth it. And it's a different activity when you're interacting with a large language model than when you're doing a search. You're there looking for a very specific answer, usually a little blue link that you want to click on so that you can buy something, book a trip, get an answer to a very specific question. When you're interacting, and we've all learned how to use AI, you're interacting with it usually, now 2 days ago, they're adding in the ability to do actions like you could be in the middle of your session with ChatGPT and you could book your hotel. So they're blending the kind of action-oriented aspect of traditional web search with large language model exploration and longer sessions. And so those are some of the differences. And I'm personally a huge fan of going down this path of large language models. I use so many of them every day. I'm sure I haven't used Claude in a day and a half. I need to go switch over to that one. Propensity, I need to go use that one because it works better for these kinds of questions. Why do I know that? Because I use it every day for different tasks. Same with ChatGPT, same with different vibe coding platforms. So I just play around a lot.
So really great insights. So next, I want to ask, when we plan to use any AI programs or strategy, so what's your strategy that we should align with the business goals and how we should step by step approach them so that we can turn it into the real results? Because right now I am seeing a lot of articles, even Lloyd reports, Gartner reports, that most of the AI projects are failing. In your opinion, how we should align and how we should strategize with our key business goals?
All right, so we're really asking, how do you drive business success with metrics? And that's actually, in my mind, that has nothing directly to do with AI. But you did allude to the fact, and we all know this, that most AI projects are failing or they're stuck in pilot, we'll call it heck. This happens all the time, and it's something that people need to realize it's as dynamic as software is. And so I take a mindset about business metrics as something that's not static, it's iterative. When I was at Microsoft working on Windows, I worked in an area called the Business Intelligence Graph. And that's when I was able to bring together Microsoft sales data, Dun& Bradstreet, other sorts of web metric data, along with Microsoft application usage data, and identify, what are the weaknesses and challenges, where are features being used, where are there features that customers aren't being used. And I worked a lot with marketing and sales and even executive. You got an hour plus to talk executive compensation and how that drives behavior. So I spent a lot of time working on key metrics at a corporate strategy level for Windows businesses. And with that, we had metrics that we talked about for customer engagement. And with those, you always think about the funnel. How do you start here, and what's the behavior you want to drive to, and how do you get people down the funnel? Defining that funnel is a long process, and that's one of the areas that people often fall short of. And one of the things, and let's jump over to AI real quick. That's one of the things we're failing to do with AI projects, is even thinking about what the funnel is. We're just going to throw it out there and assume that it's going to be AI magic and work. The next thing that we've always had to do, and this has also been something that you need to revisit on a regular basis, at least once a year, is what are your business objectives? Because that drives your trade-offs. That drives your prioritization. If your goal, as it was with Azure for a while when I worked there, was to grow scale, then you're going to be focusing in on the features that help you increase capacity, improve performance over fit and finish and usability. And that'll be what you'll need to do, because your business objective is to grow scale and not necessarily deeper engagement. If you're a more mature project or product, you're often looking now more at engagement and differentiating features, because now you have competition. So what are your business objectives? Is it, as we had with Bing, our top metric there was unique users and sessions per unique user. So are you getting people to come back and do more queries? And that was the number one thing. If people came and used Bing one time and then left, that was a failure. If they came back time and time again and increased their usage, that meant we were adding more and more value. The same thing when I worked with Office 365, because that was a very mature product, engagement was the metric. Did people have longer sessions? And here's the thing, and some people are already saying this, you of course have to have competing metrics, because engagement could also be a sign that you've got poor performance or usability is low. So you have to think about, what are your marketing objectives? Well, how do you get your users? You need to think about your business engagement metrics. The next thing that I learned is you have to be careful about what you reward for. This is like business 1000 level right here. What you reward for, you will always get more of. I remember we were rewarding in Windows for monthly active users within businesses, and we got that. I remember there was a phase in Microsoft when they had a metric for the sales team, which was about dollar amount of deals closed, and Microsoft closed a whole bunch, but they didn't have any utilization or usage targets. So our salespeople closed these deals, but there was no support to help the enterprise figure out how to use the cloud. And so we had all of this potential revenue, but people weren't, since it's a usage-based business, they weren't using it. And so by creating poor alignment, you can get negative behaviors. And so you have to think about that when you're creating metrics. What aligns to the business and what drives the correct behavior? Now, what's happening with AI? It's pretty simple. We're not doing the basics. People are like, hey, here's a great idea. Let's throw this out there. And they're throwing it out there not knowing what success looks like, not knowing how it fits to the business priority. They're simply running around saying, I've been told AI is important. Let me do something so that I can tell the board of directors I'm doing something with AI. And that's probably the biggest challenge we're having with AI success right now. Another one, and I think we'll talk more about this, I'm very big into one of the challenges with AI today is a tendency to fall back towards waterfall development versus continuous delivery, continuous integration. And with the real MVP mindset that we've had for many years in cloud and mobile development. And so you're seeing a regression from that in a lot of these AI pilot projects where people aren't approaching it from a learning mindset, from an MVP perspective. They're approaching it thinking that they have the correct answer and they'll be able to deploy it and it'll just work. So there's a lot of things going on with AI pilot failure. And probably the most important is aligning with business priorities and business metrics.
Great. All right. So thank you so much for sharing that. I have one question, that you are been practicing the ethical AI from such a long time. So can you break it down? Let's start it. What is ethical AI and how to apply it?
Well, for me, ethical AI, it's hard to talk about it today without considering AI governance. So a lot of regulations and laws are coming out that are driving specific behaviors around AI. And a lot of them are trying to capture elements of ethics. But governance is driving a lot of the fundamental behaviors of what you have to do. When I think about AI ethics, I actually start with the very first framework that I learned. I've learned the NIST framework and some others, but my favorite is still going back to the Microsoft Responsible AI framework. I think it was one of the best laid out. I do consulting with companies and I point them to this framework all the time. And there we have the 6 principles, and I don't have my slide in front of me, but it's transparency, accountability, security, safety, fairness, inclusivity, and privacy. And so those are the principles that I always think about AI and AI ethics. How does it fall along there? Of those, the ones everybody always talks about that are the biggest are fairness and bias, as well as privacy. Everybody talks about those, and I'm sure we'll talk more about them. And I've got a few things to share with you on that. But when I think about AI ethics, those are the things that I think about. How do you create a system that supports those? Like I often talk to individuals, when you're building an AI model, we have to have training data. And where do we get training data? We usually get it from the real world. And the real world is inherently biased. And so many times we have seen people create models without thinking about this, and they inherit the bias. I'll go ahead and share something with you that's a Microsoft story that's now long enough ago that it's probably okay to share. But at one point when we were doing the Hello Windows model, and we were trying to do facial recognition, we did an analysis to see how the model was doing. And we discovered that our model had a failure rate that was statistically significant for 2 subpopulations of people based upon gender and ethnicity. And those populations were darker complexioned women on a dark background and lighter complexioned women on a lighter background. And the reality is, when we looked into this, we could have discovered this by simply looking at the shape of our data. Like, we didn't measure our training data when it came in, because guess what? When we went back and looked, wow, we had fewer women in our models than we had men. And guess what? We had fewer women with different kinds of lighting background than we had men with lighting background. Can you imagine that we might somehow create a model that had a hidden bias if we weren't actually non-biased in how we collected data? Wow, I'm sure that's not an earth-shattering observation for anybody, but back there, was it 12, 13 years ago? When we made that discovery, we're like, oh my gosh, if we don't fix this, we're in so much trouble. This is Microsoft. There's also bias that can creep in how you're collecting your data. There's bias that can creep in how you're processing the data. Even if you're trying to use synthetic data, there's risks in that. And so that's why we always talk about measuring bias in your models. Privacy is one of those things. Here's another Microsoft story. When we were doing Xbox and we were adding gesture controls to Xbox, we had a lot of people, including employees, and I even did the little pinching move, and I did the I'm running type moves and stuff like that. The Xbox, though, my gestures are part of that model, or they were. One of the things that came out in regulations was people have a right to their own data, and in particular, if it's your biometric data, which includes your voice print, your face, and even to a certain degree, your gestures. And so we actually had to, by changes in regulations, delete all of that training data, because we didn't have specifics when we acquired that from individuals. So we had to create new language when we would actually have people volunteer for this. And we also had an agreement to keep the data for only 3 years because of privacy regulations. So you have to stay up on regulations. And I actually agree with these kinds of things, because I don't want my voice print owned by some mega monopoly for the rest of eternity. So understanding that maybe I could be part of something. So AI ethics is a broad category. You really need to have some expertise. I've been working on it since I started dabbling in privacy with GDPR when that came out. I sat down with lawyers and I went really deep into all of the risks we had, because I was so good at connecting different kinds of data. As you connect different kinds of data, you expose new risks. So because of my particular expertise in that area, I was able to help Microsoft create internal guardrails to reduce that. And I've done that many times now at other companies and in consulting. And so thinking about how do you manage not just the data assets you have, but when you combine them, do you have the rights to combine them? Privacy is a big one, fairness, but I could tell you so many examples of how AI has broken down and failed in terms of security. And whenever I talk to CIOs of companies, we'll just talk sometimes for half an hour about big AI mistakes, and I can rattle on and on for an hour. We could just do a blog. We could do a podcast just on AI disasters. There's a database. I think it's at I played with it so many times. I'm pretty sure it's MIT has a database where they log AI failures, incidents, and I've literally read the last 2 years worth of at least the titles of all of the incidents and details of at least 100 plus AI incidents. I just love them. I think it's because I used to be a tester and I love bugs and I love a root cause of a bug. So I think that's what brings me back in, is that I want to understand how this happened, because it just really appeals to that sinister side of me as a tester, because when I see a mistake, I can see a pattern to figure out where it might exist elsewhere. So I think that's why I do it.
Amazing. Another question is about the data leakage. So we are talking a lot about security, right? How should the companies secure their data? What are the best practices to secure?
You have an interesting way of bringing up a question that to me sounds like two questions. So let's talk securing quickly. And I'm going back to enterprise perspective here, not really a startup. So I'm a corporation. That often comes down to thinking about your security model from the very beginning. Who can have access to which data assets? What is appropriate? Now, you have this interesting dynamic that you have to manage, because we had at Microsoft and within Windows and Office, we had this concept of democratization of data. And you want that, because in order to make headway in this big data world and AI, you have to have a lot of people with a lot of access. You then have to have guardrails to make sure that before something goes out, and I have two Microsoft failures that I can share with this in a little bit, but you have to have guardrails in terms of how, when the data goes out, to make sure that it's an appropriate and fair use. There's different rules for research usage versus productization. And so you can do a few things research-wise to see if it's possible, but it might not be something that you can turn into a product. And when I say a product, it might even be a marketing measurement. And so there's sometimes, it might be internal, but is it allowed to be used? So you need to think about, how do you do layered security? We used to talk in databases as a row level, but since tends to be blob data, you have to think about how you might limit access to a lot of data for insights is still in some of a structured format. So sometimes you think about columns as well in these data stores. So you might block certain columns worth of access to it. Certainly PII, you encrypt that in every system, and it's very limited to who can have access to PII. And you always make it such that it has to be unencrypted on a per row basis. There was a company, and I can't remember right now, but they were great because they actually had, at a transaction level, and this is a great approach. I got to go find them. On a per transaction level, they had an encryption key for the data. And because the way big data works, you could actually scale and store that. I can actually encrypt every single username with a unique encryption with a store, because it's just big data. If we can handle exabytes of data, zettabytes of data for LLMs, we can certainly handle a few terabytes of keys to keep data encrypted. So that was a great innovation this company did, and I thought that was good. So encryption, isolation, levels of security, and you often do need to be careful when you allow data to be combined. Like, for example, I had access to a great deal of Microsoft sales data, which meant that I was now on the insider trading list, because in theory, I could take all of that data and I could probably build my own model to predict our Microsoft earnings. So the level of access in terms of not just what you have, but how much of it you have, can also impact the security measures that you need. So if you have global access, and again, think globally, a lot of us know this, that the laws of privacy are different by country. So you have to be very careful when you give somebody access to data that's from more than one geographic location. You also have data sovereignty. Are you allowed to take the data out? So all sorts of things to consider there. Now I'll share two examples of failures. One, Microsoft released, and this was a few years ago, and I can't believe they did this. Well, I was still at Microsoft then, so I'll say I can't believe we did this. We released a measurement that was called Office Productivity Score, and it was a measurement to help encourage people to go explore and use other features of Office, because there's so many features of Office that people don't know exist that could make them more productive. The mistake Microsoft made is that they called it Microsoft Productivity or Office Productivity Score, and they made it available to an employee's manager. Yeah, I don't have to tell you what that means, because instantly you call something productivity and, oh, well, John's productivity score is not as high as Tasha's. And so, who's the more productive person? Huge uproar in the press, massive legal risk for Microsoft. And it's hard to believe that somebody could actually, at a company like Microsoft, launch that without somebody like me going, hey, we should probably think about this before we do it. So There's an example where things you do with data can come back and bite you, which is why you need to have people like me that can think through the ethics challenges we were talking about. It's an extension on top of privacy, but it's harm that we call indirect or almost like a chilling effect that it can have because this measurement exists and it's being shared. It's something that you don't want to have happen. The second example I have for you is really recent, and this is one that didn't make a lot of press, and Microsoft probably doesn't like me constantly bringing it up because it scares everybody, but Microsoft had a vulnerability in Copilot for Outlook that was codenamed Echo Lake. And what essentially would happen, because Microsoft was really aggressive at processing emails with Copilot so that they could give you your summary and say, hey, you've got 5 messages related to the live site outage last night. You should go take a look at that. Well, what it was doing is even without you clicking on or opening an email, Copilot was looking inside the email, and somebody had figured out how to trigger Copilot into releasing information about the queries or data you had given to Copilot in your sessions. And so if you had done something like shared your own PII or credit card data with Copilot, there was the risk that that might be released through this vulnerability. Now, from what I read, they fixed it in under 48 hours, so they managed to control it. But when you think about it, that's essentially a cross-site scripting type vulnerability with AI. And we've all known about when you get an email that's suspect, don't click on it. In this case, Copilot was clicking on it for you. You were completely out of the loop, no human in the loop in terms of triggering that. And so those are some examples where poor decision-making with data, poor communication, poor strategy, and failure of imagination have led to significant mistakes.
I'm loving these stories. All right. So cloud cost can grow fast, right? So how do we plan and control spend for compute, storage, security? Like, should we build versus buy? And because of this cost also, I'm hearing a lot of stories that people are again going to on premises, like having their own servers and setting up servers. That is also happening. So what is your take on that?
So this actually takes me back 25 years back when I would do performance and scale testing, because essentially back then, what was I doing? Capacity planning. If your software performs better, you don't need as much compute. If you can manage the data correctly, if you can compress data, you don't need as much storage. And so even back 20 plus years ago, when gigabytes were large scale storage, I was working on that. So when I think about AI projects, I think about them similarly. Now, what's different these days that makes the modeling more difficult is the underlying models that you're using, because most of us build on a public LLM. The models that you're using change, and typically they grow in complexity, and the number of tokens you're using for the same task can increase on you dynamically. And so you need to be able to manage and monitor at a token usage level per transaction that you're looking at. And we know that that can have some amount of variability. So there's also hints that you want to do in order to optimize your AI usage and your token usage. Those are some things that you want to do in optimization. But again, if you say, how do you look at costs? It really comes down to a modeling thing for your AIs and how you want to think about it. And then how do you set up your usage guardrails to manage that utilization? Another thing to think about as we move into agentic AI is that that's another risk frontier, because if you expose your agent, who discovers it, how they're using and interacting with it, can drive behavior changes in your utilization that you didn't anticipate, as well as what are the agents you're calling into? What is the latency? How much data do they send back? Are people changing those? To a degree, one of the things that's growing in popularity now with AI is thinking about AI observability. It's one of the things we talk about in cloud all the time. And what we think about with DevOps and DevSecOps is observability. Well, AI model observability is one of the areas where the industry is relatively weak right now, and one of the things I'm working on. And so you need to have improvements in observability, both in terms of success of transactions, but also performance and latency and token utilization, so that you can stay on top of things and monitor when there are changes. I want to end with this one last story, because, we said that privacy was one of the big ones, but fairness is another big one in AI ethics. And I've been picking on Microsoft a little too much, so I got to pick on Apple with this one. This is one of the things that I talk about with AI is there are several costs that can come up when you make a mistake with AI. There's now, again, with AI governance, there's regulatory compliance and actual financial risks. But there's also brand risk. And in this particular case, Apple actually saw a multi-percentage drop in their stock valuation when this particular story came out. And it happened when Apple decided to launch its own credit card. So they launched a credit card, and within 2 weeks, even Wozniak, one of the founders of Apple, was posting on Twitter that Apple had a bias in the way that they set credit limits for their new Apple credit card against women. He was able to show that a woman with the exact same credit score, with the same income as a man, was getting lower credit limit than a man was. And Apple first publicly announced that gender was not used in their model. There's no way that this was possible. In fact, they'd even contracted with a third-party company to create this model for them. Great! It's still under your name, Apple, so your brand is going to take the hit. Well, when they looked into the model, and this goes back to explainability and transparency, which is one of the concepts of AI ethics, when they looked into it, what they discovered was that they trained this credit card model using data that had been used to train other credit rating systems. And one of the features they used in that data was shopping habits. Did you know that on average, women and men shop for different things with their credit cards? Did you know that AI is smart enough to figure out that women that shop for different things tend to, because of a historical bias in the credit system, get lower credit limits than men? And do you think it's possible that an AI might spot that in the data and interpret it and build it into its own model? Yes! Imagine that! And Apple and the company that worked for him had never imagined this possibility, but there it was, plain as day, obvious if you had even attempted to look at it. If you had run a basic test, you didn't even need to do a sample rate. You could have picked one woman, one man, same credit score, same income, run it through, and you would have gotten a different result. And you would have seen that you had a hidden bias. And so that was just a failure to even consider and look, because they assumed the AI, you didn't put gender in, you assume it's not there. Now be careful, this AI stuff is pretty dang smart. Everybody might be seeing their AI pilots get stuck. At the board of directors and the CEO level, everybody is concerned about AI incidents and running afoul of governance. And so there's a lot of lack of understanding there, a lot of trepidation. And that's where I'm focusing, because I don't want things to get stalled because of fear and uncertainty. I want to be able to help companies move forward. Hope this was useful.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure having you here, Ken. Wishing you continued success in your journey with data and AI. Thank you.